PodGo a few days ago. It's pretty cool, but I'm getting tons of questions from people who have the HX Stomp or who are considering one of these units. Which one's better? Do they sound the same? Which one would be better for them? So I just wanted to make a quick video explaining some of the features of each, what they have in common, and some scenarios where I think one might be better than the other for your use case. So to start off, they both do sound the same. They have the exact same processing, all the same models, except for a few high DSP models that are not present in the PodGo, like the King of Tone, the Clotthorn Drive, and the Cosmos Echo. But other than that, all the models are exactly the same. So you don't have to worry about compromising on sound quality with the PodGo just because it's a little cheaper. They both are USB audio interfaces, so you can record what you're playing. You can play along with audio from your computer. They both allow you to set the input to USB channel 3 and 4 in order to reamp dry guitar from your DAW, and you can record your dry guitar input from these units. On the PodGo, you'd want to create a channel with USB input 3, and on the HX Stomp it'd be USB channel 5, but that'll be your dry guitar input, which is useful because you might want to tweak some tones later, so you can take that dry guitar and then run it back through these units all digitally. So they both do that. That's a really useful feature that I use all the time. Both units do have TRS balanced outputs, so that means you can use a TRS to XLR cable to connect directly to a mixer or a stage box that has XLR outputs. And both units allow you to just run a regular instrument cable into a power amp and guitar cab if you want to go that direction and mic the guitar cab. They both have a stereo effects loop, but this is where the differences are starting here. The Stomp, you can run the effects loop as 2 mono effects loops or 1 stereo effects loop, whereas on the PodGo, it can only be 1, either mono or stereo effects loop. PodGo obviously has 6-foot switches that you can set up sort of like a pedal board. It's got a dedicated tap tuner and a mode switch. In Stomp mode, this is sort of like a pedal board. You can turn things on and off. And if you hit the mode switch, you've got your different presets here and bank up and down. If you hit bank up and down at the same time, it'll take you to snapshot mode, where you can change between the 4 snapshots. So this gives you a lot of flexibility without having to get any other foot switches or anything like that. PodGo has 4 snapshots, whereas the HX Stomp only has 3. The HX Stomp obviously only has 3 foot switches. Usually people are going to use foot switch 3 as a tap tuner, so that kind of leaves you with just 2 foot switches. You can add a 2-button foot switch to this, so that gives you up to 5 total foot switches, but if you're using 1 as tap tuner, that leaves you with 4 for stomps, or you can change the foot switch mode or change presets, things like that. With the PodGo, you also can add a 2-button foot switch to the expression jack, so that gives you up to 8 stomps in stomp mode, so that's pretty useful as well. So as far as DSP processing power, like I said, they do have the same amount of processing power, but right now the Stomp is limited to 6 blocks. In firmware 3.0, it's going to get 8 blocks, but that's not going to give you any more DSP. So pretty much those 2 extra blocks are going to have to be used for things like an effects loop, volume pedal, a clean boost like a gain block or something like that doesn't really use much DSP. Even though you're limited to 6 blocks, those 6 blocks can be anything that you want. So they could be 6 delays, you could have 2 amps and 2 cabs in stereo. You can kind of set it up however you want. Whereas with the PodGo, your effects chain is a little bit more fixed. So every preset is going to have an amp, a cab, a volume, a wah, and an EQ. And then you can add up to 4 other blocks that can be anything you want. So you could have a compressor and drive in front of the amp, and then you could have a delay and reverb after the amp, or you could have 3 delays in front of the amp and a phaser after the amp if you wanted to. And another thing to note is that you can move around the blocks wherever you want. So you could put the volume pedal after the amp, or you could put the EQ before. It doesn't really matter. You can move things around, but you can't delete those 5 blocks that I mentioned earlier. It is worth mentioning that you can bypass any of the fixed blocks. Even though every preset has them, you can bypass the amp if you wanted to use this with a real amp and cab. If you wanted to use an amp model with a power amp and a real guitar cab, you could bypass the cab block and then run straight out of the main outs to front of house, or the amp out into a power amp and guitar cab. Also, obviously, the PodGo has an expression pedal, and you can switch between the 2 expression pedals just by pushing the toe switch. Here you can see it's switching from red to green. And by default, one of them controls the volume pedal, and then the other controls the wah and turns on the wah. So just like a traditional wah, you hit the toe switch, and then the expression pedal functions as a wah pedal. So obviously, the Stomp doesn't have that. To me, the most important difference between these 2 units is that the Stomp has parallel routing. So if you want to run stereo amps, you have to have the Stomp. You can't use the PodGo. If you're playing bass, the Stomp is probably a better choice because you can run your amp on one path, and then in parallel you can run a drive and then blend that in to your dry, clean amp tone, which is a typical bass technique that you would do, so that you don't lose some low end when you overdrive that bass signal. That's not to say that you can't get good bass tones from the PodGo, but if you want to run some gained up tones, you're probably going to want to stick with something that can do parallel routing, like the HX Stomp or one of the bigger units. So here's a few scenarios where I think one might work better than the other. So the type of person that has a big pedal board already, they like their pedals, they just want to use something as a clean amp platform, and they get most of their sounds from their pedals, the HX Stomp is probably a better option. It's small, it can fit on a pedal board. You can set up stereo amps, you can run things before it, you can run things in the effects loop. Another person that I'd probably recommend the Stomp to is somebody whose needs are really minimal. Maybe they just use an amp and a cab, maybe a couple effects. The Stomp is so small it can fit in a suitcase. Maybe they're playing acoustic, or maybe they're just throwing a few of these in a rack or something for the whole band. This is also a good option for maybe a church that is doing backline, where they're going to have the backline amps for their volunteers that bring pedal boards. You can run 2 totally separate signal paths on here. You could have 1 amp, cab, and EQ, and then another amp and cab in EQ for 2 different guitar players. So for $600, it's tough to beat that. So as far as the Pod Go, this is a great unit for somebody that wants an all-in-one rig. They don't want to mess with pedals. They just want to buy one thing and have that be their full rig that they can grab and go. Somebody that's taking public transportation to their gigs where they have to carry it for a long period of time. They can't take a bunch of Pelicans or big amps to their gig. This is a great option for them, and I'd probably recommend it over the HX Stomp for them. Also, obviously, somebody that's really budget conscious, for $450, you can have your full rig, direct to front of house, with some great sound. So this is a great option for people that are on a strict budget. Again, it's worth reiterating that the HX Stomp is probably a better choice for bass players just because of the parallel routing. And lastly, I think that the Pod Go would be great for maybe a singer in a band. They can just set up snapshots here. So go over to preset mode and hit up, down at the same time. And then they can just switch between 4 different sounds, maybe clean, crunch, lead, and then maybe like a different effect like the chorus or something. This would be great. Somebody that doesn't want to think about pedals or tap dancing, that needs to focus on singing and engaging the crowd. So that pretty much answers most of the questions I've been getting about Pod Go and HX Stomp. Let me know if you have any other questions in the comments, or which one you chose and why you chose it, which one works better for you. And make sure to subscribe. I'm going to have tons of new Pod Go content coming out pretty soon here. So stay tuned. Thanks, guys.